When browsing Wikipedia for research related to future videos, I discovered something that is quite interesting indeed. There is a precedence for this the other way around, but I had never seen a case like this where it is completely reversed from what you would expect is normally the case with these types of things. Now, what I'm talking about is an aspect of the Star Wars new canon, the Disney timeline from 2014 to present, being canonized into the old timeline, the Star Wars expanded universe. What is so interesting about this is the expanded universe obviously is, well, unfortunately, mostly discontinued. We've gotten one comic issue, several short comics, and some video game expansions, but for the most part, the EU was discontinued in 2014. All we've gotten are dribbles of new content. New content nonetheless, keeping it alive, but not enough to warrant an official continuing timeline in a large capacity. And what Disney seems to enjoy doing is cherry pick ideas from the old timeline and take old characters and put them in the new timeline, canonizing them, right? Taking stuff from the old canon and putting it in the new canon. Examples of this are, Grand Admiral Thrawn, Revan. Certain characters have gotten mentioned in the new timeline, making them canon to the new timeline that were originally from the old timeline, right? And Disney seems to think this is what we want. They seem to think we want our characters that we love to be in this new timeline. They're completely off base. They have no idea that what we want is for our timeline to continue in an official capacity, our timeline to continue having stories told in that old timeline. That's what we want. We don't care about what you call canon. We are more than happy to define canon, Disney. So Mickey Mouse, if you're listening, we don't want our characters placed in your timeline. We want our timeline to continue. But nonetheless, a lot of precedence has been set for ideas from the old timeline getting put in the new timeline. However, I'd never heard of an instance where something from the new timeline shows up in the old timeline until now. When browsing Wikipedia, I noticed something very peculiar about a species that I did know about that was from the canon timeline. Now, back in 2018, 2019, I was reading the canon timeline. I was giving it a shot, trying to like it. It was so bad that I had to quit. I could not face reading stuff in that in that new timeline there. It was just very disappointing. However, I read a comic called the Princess Leia comic that was released by Marvel as a limited series. I picked up the graphic novel super cheap and gave it a read. Overall, it was quite a mediocre generic story. However, there was a species in it called Esperion. The Esperion are this red-skinned species with green eyes that they're sort of interesting looking, and then they have a hybrid species that's called Alder Esperion, which are hybrids of Esperion mixed with humans. And I believe, I could be misremembering, but I believe it was specifically Alderaanian human and Esperion hybrids that gave Alder Esperions. Well, this species was exclusive to the canon timeline. It was created for that comic series. I don't think it's been explored in canon too much since, because it's not as connective as the expanded universe was. But disregarding that, the Princess Leia comic introduced the Esperion race. In 2015, they released the comic and introduced the concept. However, the Esperion also exist in the Star Wars Legends expanded universe continuity. So they took something from the new timeline and put it in the old timeline, which is super interesting to be sure. The Esperion in the old timeline appear in Knights of the Eternal Throne, which is an expansion of the Star Wars Old Republic MMO game. Knights of the Eternal Throne is a digital expansion for the game, so new levels, new designs, new costumes, new characters, stuff like that. New storyline as well is a big part of that. And the Esperion were put in Knights of the Eternal Throne, an expansion of Star Wars The Old Republic. This expansion was released in 2016, so a year after the comic. And some writer decided to put the Esperion in the exclusively expanded universe Legends continuity. Knights of the Eternal Throne is not like a dual canon, it's not in both timelines. It's exclusive to the old timeline, but they took the Esperion and put them in the game. In the game, we don't get a lot. We don't even get a physical description of them, so there's no way of knowing if it's the exact species. But what are the coincidences of creating a species spelled the exact same way by two different creators? I think it's more likely that the creator did intend that the Asperion in the Legends timeline is the same from the canon timeline. Though visually we don't have proof of this. The Asperion in the game is assigned a species to a legendary Jedi named Handi. And Handi was this legendary Jedi who they didn't know where he had died. But in the game, researchers discovered Handi's long-lost resting place. And Handi was a member of the Asperion species. So there you have it. Something from the new timeline getting canonized into the old timeline. There's a precedence for this, because some people wondered about this. For example, in Supernatural Encounters, there's supposed to be characters from Rebels in Supernatural Encounters, which is set in the old timeline. So introducing concepts from canon to the expanded universe, it's not just an exclusive thing to Supernatural Encounters by Joe Bongiorno. There's already precedence for this. So for people complaining about that, just look at this. There's already an example of something from the new canon, Disney, Star Wars timeline, crossing back and getting canonized into the old Star Wars Expanded Universe Legends timeline. It's quite a story. It's very interesting indeed, because I'd seen EU stuff get canonized in canon, but I had never seen something canon get canonized in the EU. I had no idea about this, and I don't think many people have a knowledge of this. It's quite an obscure species in both timelines, but it's very interesting nonetheless. The Asperion are now dual canon in both timelines, even though it was first introduced in canon. It's quite crazy, and this is a good thing, because this means that for people who like canon, if the EU were to continue, some of the concepts of canon could be, theoretically, placed in the old timeline. You know, you like the Mandalorian character. I've not watched The Mandalorian, but for people who do, if the EU continued, who's to say you couldn't put Djarin, or however his name is, into the EU? I wouldn't be opposed, I wouldn't be for it, but, I mean, now there's precedence for this occurring. So who's to say it can't happen again? I think this is a sign that, you know, Rebels being put in Supernatural Encounters, it's not a bad thing. As long as you don't take the whole story of Rebels and just aspects of it, aspects that were introduced, and put it in the EU, there's nothing wrong with that, to canonize something into the EU. And like I keep saying, now I've discovered precedence for it. So I thought this was a super interesting topic, and I wanted to share it with all of you, because I didn't think a lot of people knew about this. So let me know what you guys think of this. How do you feel about this? This is very peculiar.